mean, honestly, like, some people will always like a book better than a movie, and some people will like a movie better than a book, but, like, I think that, like, we just did our best the book and honor the fans and I think really make something.
What began as a fight for justice has now spiraled into one of the most uncomfortable courtroom dramas in Hollywood history, and Blake Lively is at the center of it all. For months, the headlines surrounding Blake Lively have felt less like celebrity gossip and more like a slow-motion implosion. The actress, once celebrated for her grace and polished public image, now finds herself entangled in a lawsuit that grows stranger with every filing. What started as a claim of harassment and retaliation has evolved into something far more complex, a legal labyrinth where memory, motive, and media collide. It all began with a film, a production that was supposed to be another milestone in her career. But behind the glamour of movie sets and studio contracts, the reality was far darker. During filming, Blake alleged that she was subjected to deeply inappropriate behavior from a senior producer. Her claims centered on one moment.
I believe that if you read the book and you saw the movie that you wouldn't be thrilled. Like, we really worked hard on that. Yeah. But I also saw the movie and then read the book, you wouldn't go, hold on, this isn't like, right. You can, that really, like, you can.
A video shown to her without consent, a birth recording that, she says, left her shaken and humiliated. The clip, she insists, was more than just unprofessional. It was invasive, personal, and profoundly disturbing. The accused producer, Jamie Heath, offered a very different version. According to him, the video was nothing more than an artistic reference, an example of a home birth scene meant to inform the project's tone. He claimed there was no intent to offend, no hidden malice, and certainly no exploitation. But as both sides exchanged accusations, something in the story began to fracture. The video itself became the center of the storm, a piece of evidence that should have clarified everything, but instead made the case even murkier. Blake argued that what had been handed over during discovery wasn't the same footage she remembered. She said the version she saw had been edited, censored, altered beyond recognition. The defense insisted otherwise. To them, it was a complete, transparent submission. Nothing withheld, nothing hidden. And that's when the lawsuit took its sharpest turn. Lively's legal team filed yet another motion, this time for sanctions. They claimed the defendants had withheld crucial evidence, deliberately obstructing her path to justice. Her motion was bold, aggressive, and public. She accused Wayfair, the company tied to the film's production, of ignoring a court order to provide the full, unaltered footage. But when the motion surfaced, observers noticed something peculiar. The timing, the tone, the way it arrived just as other crucial rulings loomed. It felt less like a procedural filing and more like a statement, one crafted not only for the court but for the headlines. Even the judge's calendar hinted at what might come next. Motions for summary judgment, decisions that could either validate Lively's claims or dismantle them entirely. As legal experts dissected the documents, one question began to surface. Was this motion an act of strategy or of desperation? Because at this stage, the stakes couldn't be higher. If her claims failed, the entire case could collapse before it ever reached a jury. And if that happened, the public narrative might turn against her completely. Behind the courtroom filings and redacted exhibits lies something deeper. A story about control, image, and the lengths to which a celebrity might go to defend both. The legal system may be built on evidence, but in the court of public opinion, perception is everything. And in that arena, Blake Lively was already fighting an uphill battle. What happened next would blur the line between legal defense and public theater, a battle fought as much in whispers and press releases as in sworn statements. The motion for sanctions landed like a grenade in an already volatile case. It accused Jamie Heath and his legal team of failing to comply with a court order, a claim that, if proven, could redefine the entire lawsuit. Lively's attorneys argued that the video Heath produced was incomplete, a selective version designed to minimize the emotional impact of what she'd endured. They wanted the court to compel the release of every second of footage, unedited, uncensored, unfiltered. But it wasn't just about a video anymore. It was about credibility. Lively's team framed the issue as one of trust, suggesting that if the defendants could manipulate what she saw, then perhaps they could manipulate everything else too. In their filings, they painted a picture of a workplace gone wrong, where a respected actress was left powerless to defend her own boundaries. The opposing side, however, countered with precision. They claimed that they had followed every order, every rule, and that nothing was missing. The footage Lively described, they said, simply didn't exist. To them, her accusations weren't about justice. They were about narrative, a desperate attempt to reframe a failing case as a moral crusade. That back and forth ignited something beyond the courtroom walls. Online, fans and critics began to choose sides. Was Lively a victim fighting for dignity, or a celebrity using the power of her platform to bend perception? Every update from the courthouse became a headline. Every filing turned into a trending topic. And yet, beneath the noise, a more subtle question lingered. What did this motion really aim to achieve? Some legal analysts noted its timing. The filing appeared just as the defense prepared to move for summary judgment, a procedural step that could have ended the case before trial. By accusing them of withholding evidence, Lively's team may have been buying time, creating doubt, and forcing the court to slow down. Others saw it as a calculated PR move, an attempt to reassert control over a story that was slipping away. Inside legal circles, this tactic had a name: narrative preservation. When the facts don't favor you, shift the story. Make the fight about principle. Make it emotional. And few stars understood the power of emotion better than Blake Lively. Still, the motion's language raised eyebrows even among her supporters. Phrases like irreparable harm and deep emotional trauma seemed crafted for the public as much as for the judge. Even the way her attorneys described the missing footage, a moment stripped of dignity and privacy, read like something out of a screenplay. It was a plea for empathy, not just evidence. Behind the scenes, whispers grew louder that the lawsuit itself was teetering. Court records suggested procedural missteps, incomplete filings, jurisdictional oversights, and questions about whether the right defendants had even been named. Those details rarely make headlines, but they can destroy a case. And perhaps Lively knew that, because if the legal fight was faltering, then shaping the public narrative might be her only remaining defense. Her critics saw manipulation. Her supporters saw courage. But to everyone watching, it was clear. This wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about control, who had it, who had lost it, and how far each side was willing to go to reclaim it. As the filings piled up, the tone of the case shifted again. What had once been a civil lawsuit began to feel like a slow, public unmasking. Not just of the facts, but of everyone involved. At the center of all this chaos was a single, haunting piece of evidence: the birth video. To some, it was nothing more than an obscure production reference, a moment captured by a husband during an at-home delivery. To others, it was a violation, a moment never meant to be replayed, especially not inside a professional setting. According to Blake Lively's account, the clip showed the wife of producer Jamie Heath fully nude, giving birth in an intimate home environment. Lively claimed she was blindsided, that the video appeared suddenly on set without warning or context, and that she stopped it immediately, believing she was being shown pornography. Heath, she said, tried to justify it, explaining it was a depiction of beauty, of authenticity, of life. But for Lively, that explanation only deepened the discomfort. When Wayfair's attorneys produced a version of the video in court, redacted, edited, and blacked out in certain sections, Lively said it wasn't the same one she remembered. The video, she insisted, had been shortened, manipulated, sanitized. The defense maintained that it was the only copy in existence, and that nothing had been hidden. Both sides stood firm, their stories diverging completely. That conflict turned a simple evidentiary dispute into an emotional standoff. Lively's new filing demanded that the court sanction Heath and compel the release of every second of footage, no matter how personal. Her lawyers argued that without it, she couldn't prove her claim that she had been forced to watch something deeply invasive, something no one should ever have been shown. But the deeper the filing went, the more uncomfortable it became. If another, more explicit version of the video did exist, it would mean exposing the private, vulnerable moment of a woman who wasn't even part of the lawsuit, Natasha Heath, Jamie's wife. Suddenly, what had begun as a legal issue became an ethical one. Would pursuing this footage mean violating Natasha's dignity all over again? That question lingered like static in the air. Commentators began asking whether Lively's fight for truth had crossed a moral line. In trying to prove her own trauma, was she inflicting it on someone else? The irony wasn't lost on anyone watching. Inside the filings, the defense accused Lively of twisting facts. They said she was weaponizing emotion, turning a misunderstanding into a campaign of public humiliation. They included screenshots, deposition transcripts, and even text exchanges to prove that the entire moment had been mischaracterized. One section of their response described the birth video as a depiction of natural life, respectful and censored. The contrast between that phrasing and Lively's own description, pornographic, shocking, and violating, couldn't have been sharper. And yet, beyond the legal sparring, something more human began to emerge. Natasha Heath, the woman in the video, was no longer an unseen figure. In Lively's filings, she became collateral damage. Online, strangers speculated about her without her consent, dissecting fragments of her private life. What had once been an act of intimacy between husband and wife was now evidence in a case broadcast to the world. Observers described the moment as the breaking point. The lawsuit had stopped being about corporate accountability. It was about humiliation, perception, and power. Every document filed seemed to dig the trench deeper, each side more determined not to blink first. Somewhere between those courtrooms and the online headlines, the real tragedy began to surface. Not a scandal about evidence, but a story about how far people will go to win a narrative. And in that race, empathy was the first casualty. As the legal filings multiplied, something unexpected happened. The court itself began to lose patience. Judges prefer precision, not spectacle, and the Lively case was starting to look like the latter. Her requests for sanctions, her challenges to the defendant's credibility, even the tone of her motions, all of it began to read like an ongoing confrontation rather than a clear pursuit of justice. Observers inside the courtroom described a subtle shift. What had once been sympathy for an actress alleging mistreatment began turning into quiet frustration. Each motion grew more dramatic, each headline louder. It was becoming harder to separate law from performance. The defense seized on that. In their own filings, they portrayed Lively's team as reckless, a group more interested in controlling public opinion than in following legal protocol. They pointed out that the plaintiff hadn't properly filed certain administrative documents with the EOC before launching her claims. They questioned whether she'd even sued the correct employer. If those procedural flaws held, her case could unravel entirely, regardless of the emotional weight behind it. Lively's attorneys countered, arguing that the defendants were hiding behind technicalities to avoid accountability. They emphasized her courage, her willingness to speak up despite the risks to her career. To them, this was about principle, not paperwork. But timing, again, told a different story. Each time a major ruling approached, another motion appeared. Each time momentum shifted against her, a new claim was filed, something to reset the conversation. To legal analysts, it looked less like a fight for truth and more like a game of survival. And yet, there was no denying the emotional power behind her narrative. In interviews and court declarations, she spoke about feeling silenced, dismissed, isolated. For a public figure known for composure, those admissions struck a chord. She described sleepless nights, flashbacks, an overwhelming sense that the system was stacked against her. Whether you believed her or not, her words carried the unmistakable cadence of someone desperate to be heard. Meanwhile, her opponents moved quietly but strategically. Wayfair's lawyers filed responses that were almost clinical in tone. Dry, factual, void of emotion. They included exhibits, correspondence, and affidavits designed to counter every accusation. One paragraph in particular stood out. The plaintiff's recollection is demonstrably inconsistent with the evidence produced. The footage in question has been reviewed in full. No further material exists. Those words, calm and final, seemed to close a door that Lively's team was determined to keep open. The more the court heard, the clearer it became that this was no longer a straightforward employment case. It had evolved into a clash between two realities, one emotional, one procedural, between a woman insisting her memory held the truth and a defense insisting the facts said otherwise. Outside the courthouse, the public divided itself accordingly. Some saw Lively as a symbol of resilience in the face of an uncaring system. Others saw her as an actress extending her own performance into the courtroom, using every camera and headline to her advantage. Either way, she had become the story. And that story, once meant to expose injustice, now risked consuming her entire reputation. By the time the next hearing date approached, one question echoed louder than any other. Had Blake Lively's pursuit of justice turned into her own undoing? By the time the next hearing arrived, the tension in the courtroom was almost physical. Cameras waited outside. Commentators speculated inside. And as Blake Lively entered, the flash of reporters' lenses drowned out the soft hum of whispered conversations. The woman who once embodied Hollywood grace now stood beneath fluorescent lights, her confidence visibly worn down by the weight of her own case. What unfolded that day was less about discovery and more about revelation. The judge addressed both sides with unmistakable irritation, questioning the necessity of repeated filings and the increasingly personal tone of the arguments. Each lawyer spoke in circles, citing procedure and precedent, but beneath the legal language was something unmistakable: fatigue. The case had begun to devour itself. The judge's remarks hinted at skepticism. He suggested that continued accusations of withheld evidence might be premature, even unfounded. And though he stopped short of reprimanding Lively's team, the message was clear: the court was not a stage. Outside, the headlines told a different story. Blake fights back. Lively demands justice. The media machine translated each procedural note into a narrative of resilience. To the public, she was still standing tall, a woman refusing to be silenced. But inside the courtroom, it felt different. There, her motions were beginning to sound like echoes in an empty hall. Privately, even some of her supporters began to worry. Each new filing seemed to tighten the noose around the original complaint. The focus had drifted so far from the initial allegations that few remembered what the lawsuit was supposed to prove. The conversation had shifted entirely to whether the case would survive long enough to reach trial. Meanwhile, the people caught in the crossfire, Jamie and Natasha Heath, had withdrawn from the public eye. Their names remained in the filings, but they stopped responding to media requests. Those who knew them described a growing sense of exhaustion and fear. What had begun as an employment dispute had turned into a public dissection of their private lives. And as Lively's team continued pressing for sanctions, the collateral damage deepened. Yet, even in the midst of legal uncertainty, Lively never wavered in her conviction that she had been wronged. Her public statements framed the case as part of a broader pattern of women being ignored, of systems designed to protect institutions rather than individuals. To her followers, she had become something larger than a litigant. She was a symbol, standing at the intersection of celebrity and justice, pushing back against the invisible machinery that governs both. Still, every symbol has its shadow, and for all her resilience, the narrative she built began to turn against her. Comment sections grew sharper. Former allies went silent. Analysts began asking the question no one wanted to raise. If the evidence wasn't there, was this entire case destined to implode? The ruling on the sanctions motion was still weeks away, but already whispers of dismissal were spreading. And if that happened, it wouldn't just be a legal defeat, it would be a public reckoning. For Blake Lively, that was the true cost of the battle she'd started. She had turned her private trauma into a public crusade. And now, win or lose, she couldn't step back, not without facing the question that had haunted her from the start. Was this still about justice or about control? The ruling finally came down on a gray Thursday morning, the kind of day that felt suspended between tension and exhaustion. Inside the courthouse, anticipation crackled. Outside, journalists leaned into their microphones, waiting for the first sign of movement from the judge's chambers. And then it happened, a ruling that, while measured, carried the weight of finality. The court denied the motion for sanctions. There would be no rebuke, no forced production of new evidence, no symbolic victory. In a brief but unmistakable order, the judge concluded that the defendants had complied with the court's directives and that the plaintiff had not provided sufficient grounds to justify further penalties. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was quieter than that, more surgical. But to anyone who had followed the case, it was clear Blake Lively's legal momentum had just run out. For weeks afterward, her team maintained a calm front. They promised appeals, hinted at new filings, and reassured supporters that the fight was far from over. Yet the energy had shifted. Public sympathy, once her greatest ally, began to erode. The same audience that had once seen courage now saw contradiction. The same headlines that once spoke of strength now whispered about stubbornness. Behind the scenes, sources close to the production said Wayfair was ready to move on. The company wanted distance from the controversy, from the headlines, and from the actress who had turned a workplace dispute into a nationwide conversation. What was once a partnership built on creative ambition had become a fracture too deep to mend. And then came the final blow. In an administrative ruling unrelated to the sanction dispute, the judge questioned whether Lively's entire case had been filed in the proper jurisdiction. It was a procedural note, small in print, but massive in implication. Without that jurisdiction, every other argument could vanish, dismissed not on merit, but on geography. Within days, court trackers began speculating that a dismissal was inevitable. And when that happened, there would be no public verdict, no cinematic courtroom climax. Just silence. The kind of silence that ends stories without resolving them. For Blake Lively, that silence might have been the hardest part. She had poured herself into this case, framing it as a stand for accountability and personal truth. But now her words existed mostly in transcripts, echoes of a fight that few wanted to remember. The deeper question, however, lingered long after the gavel fell. What had this battle really been about? Some believed it was a genuine attempt to confront exploitation within the industry, a demand for respect in spaces where boundaries had long been ignored. Others saw it as a calculated effort to control the narrative, to stay visible, to rewrite the public perception of a fading star. Both interpretations carried truth. Both carried tragedy. When reporters caught up with her outside her Manhattan apartment weeks later, Lively declined to comment. She smiled politely, whispered, "No statements today," and disappeared behind a tinted car window. The camera shutters followed her until she was gone, until all that remained was the reflection of their own flash in the glass. The lawsuit may have ended, but the story did not. In the age of headlines and hashtags, endings are just pauses between narratives. And somewhere in that pause, between justice and judgment, between accusation and truth, Blake Lively's story remains suspended. Not as a victory, not as a defeat, but as a reminder that in Hollywood, the line between performance and reality is always thinner than it seems.